I, Olden Day James, have recently become aware of an imposter. This man claims to preach the good word of ghee. But no ghee does he. He's even so boastful to claim that he could explain the good work of Even Amundsen. But I will find him. Even if it brings me to the bowels of the earth.
Imposter! Who are you calling the imposter? You realize your presence in this universe is going to create a fracture in the space-time continuum. You must be banished from this universe at once! You're the only one that will vanish! Imposter Day James! I will rid of you like I'm rid of every other being on this planet! You, sir, are not qualified to draw! You don't know me!
Emulating Even Amundsen.
In order to fully understand a pose, and to replicate it in perspective, it's extremely useful to analyze its proportions orthographically. I begin by doing a rough sketch from both the front and side views. I'm just trying to block out the major forms and the contortions of the spine. As I'm doing this, I establish a unit distance, d, that will compare everything back to. Using this distance, I can accurately measure where each appendage will be. For example, the pelvis spans from a height of 1d to 2d. You can use the plane duplication techniques discussed in Scott Robertson's book and I discussed in the early perspective videos. But I'm just trying to eyeball it here so that I can avoid using too many lines and build up my intuition. Once I finish sketching out these characters, I then encapsulate them in a primitive form that I'll place on my perspective grid. I create two flat planes, a ground plane and a vertical plane. I then divide my ground plane in half several times, establishing our unit distance here in orange. I'll recreate the encapsulating primitive form here on the perspective grid. And once again, I'm just trying to eyeball those unit distances. Using edge loops, as I've described in previous videos, allows me to find the same height at different points in space. Essentially, it functions as a ruler in all three dimensions. And now we'll create a more detailed primitive blockout with the aid of the encapsulating form. You can use any variety of primitive blockouts for your character, but here I'm going to use some that are reminiscent of the Taiwanese artist Krentz Kuchart's. One of the most important things while doing this is making sure that your character appears grounded. Using the perspective grid will help you properly place the feet, and since the feet are often at different angles, it's important to understand how rotating forms works. Another feature of pose that we need to remain cognizant of while doing this is the character's balance. As I've demonstrated in several videos so far, it's really beneficial to be able to control your camera placement and movement. Once again, I'll start in the same way as we did in the previous example, but now we'll take it a step further by panning the camera downward. Again, I sketch the poses in an orthographic view and establish a unit distance. This unit distance will help us compare the placement of each appendage back to the ground plane. This initial perspective blockout already gives us a decent bit of information. It tells us how far away our camera is positioned from the ground, and it gives us a rough estimate of what lens we're using. So again, now that I've figured out my unit distances, I can create the encapsulating primitive form. I know from my orthographic view that my rib cage is placed 2 distances high. and the pelvis around 1.5. And the feet are placed a little under 2 unit distances apart. If you ever lose track of where you're drawing in 3-dimensional space, create a center line in your form, and then draw a guideline back down to the ground plane. Remember that all these guides and forms are just tools for our measurement. Okay, so now we're going to take the same pose, but we'll pan the camera downward and tilt it up. From this view, we'll be looking up at the bottom of the chin. Since the camera is now closer to the floor, the convergences of the ground plane are much faster than they were. This time, I decided to start the character by drawing in the feet. There's no one correct way to do this. In this instance, I just found it easier to start with the feet, because it helped me relate it back to the ground plane. Also, definitely use reference while doing this. Our goal is to make believable poses. So even if you're doing something that's highly stylized, it needs to have its basis in reality. So now we're going to repeat all of the same steps that we did in the previous examples. It might seem odd that we're already 6 minutes into a video on pose, and I haven't even discussed gesture drawing yet. One of the reasons is that there's already an abundance of resources on the internet describing this, but the other is that gesture drawing isn't as practical for understanding how poses distort in various angles. This is not to say that gesture drawing doesn't have a purpose, because it's extremely useful for building a mental repository of poses, and making them more fluid and balanced. All of these steps should seem familiar at this point, but if you're having trouble at any point in this process, make sure to slow down and take it step by step. If you have trouble drawing perspective grids, then make sure you're capable of doing that first before moving on. And since some of the forms can be twisted at different angles, like those of the pelvis and ribcage, it's important to be able to rotate 3-dimensional forms. Notice that when I take this plane, and I rotate it clockwise, the left vanishing point moves closer to the center, and the right vanishing point moves further into the periphery. However, even though they're using new vanishing points, they're still converging at the same horizon line. Even if you're not at the level of doing this exercise, it's even useful practice just to create these grids and rotate them in perspective. Once you feel comfortable doing it freehand, then have a go at this exercise. Since the character is now crouched, it's much shorter than that of the standing poses. Try to make constructive observations about each pose. For example, in this one, I noticed that the angle of the torso was slightly more steep than the angle of the thigh. In addition to that, the character's right elbow, or the elbow on our left, was resting atop his right knee. And now I'll repeat the same thing, except this time the camera will be moved to the right. Try to imagine what would happen if you were sitting there in front of the character with the camera in hand, and you started panning to the right. The front of the character will become less prominent as we begin to see more and more of the side view. Once again, our primitive forms and grid help us place in the character and position him properly. The wrapping lines on each of the appendages help indicate its perspective by demonstrating what ellipse would form were we to take a cross-section. So we've shown how we can reposition our camera around our subject. But what happens if we allow our camera to roll, and then we capture these poses in time? For this demonstration, I'm only going to do a starting pose and an ending pose, but you could hypothetically do an infinite number of frames in between. You're probably getting tired of seeing it, but we're going to repeat all of the same steps that we've done before, now for the beginning and ending poses. Already based on this perspective grid, we can tell that the camera is positioned above, looking down. Then I establish the distance arbitrarily, but I make sure that my unit is repeated properly on both axes. Now with my framework once again in place, I can start by sketching our character. Alright, now we'll lower the opacity of the first pose and draw the final pose of the sword swing. And now we'll test the movement between the two poses to see if it seems natural. In the final part of this video, I want to take one of these poses that we've created and do a nice line drawing over it. As with all the guidelines that we've used in previous videos, feel free to break out of them. Notice that the armor is already starting to curve further outwards than the initial torso blockout. Recall back to the first part of this series for coming up with the textures and understanding line weight and cast shadows. Alright guys, and that's it for this week's video. If you like this, please subscribe and consider supporting the channel on patreon.com/moderndayjames. We have a lot of cool perks, like access to the archive of full-length live streams, critiques during live streams, and group lessons. You can also stay up to date with the channel by following me on Twitter and joining our Discord server. And again, I'll be live streaming every Friday through Sunday at 1 PM Eastern Standard Time, and uploading every week. Alright guys, see you later.